Okay, hi everybody. Today I'm going to talk about structure. I know that can be a scary word, so maybe I'll toggle between structure and style. But basically, the way that I want you to approach this assignment is to, first of all, we've been taught to kind of focus on content, okay, and so we're gonna, because you've been taught to focus on content, I am going to also kind of, use this opportunity to uh, think about the way in which certain authors, I'm going to use 4 examples here, utilize very specific techniques in their writing to convey a message. So I think that's something that we're all kind of used to, right? Is this idea that when we're quote unquote analyzing a text, what we're doing is really trying to kind of think about the way in which authors are utilizing structure to achieve an intended effect. Some of you might have, heard in your classes the term rhetoric. If so, you might have heard of pathos, ethos, logos as not very helpful words to help to kind of invite you to think about, how authors utilize techniques to achieve an intended effect. Those techniques being, the one that our brains kind of lock into, which is pathos, since, we all understand when someone uses an exclamation, right? It's like if you use an exclamation mark, you're trying to emphasize something, and there's emotion behind it, right? I don't shout to the heavens if I'm not experiencing emotion. We tend to have a harder time if we've heard the terms ethos and logos. Again, these are not very helpful terms. But if you have heard them, right, then you've probably heard some version of ethos that has to do with the character of the author, right? This would be the author, the kind of the personality that the author utilizes in order to achieve the intended effect. And then logos, which I've seen a lot of students kind of associate with like fact or logic, which again, not helpful. But I think that what is kind of interesting about keep maintaining those categories, right? The categories of kind of emotion that we can see conveyed through the use of things as simple as punctuation, italics, word choices, details, blah, 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 right? I think that it is kind of helpful for us to maintain this idea that when we are looking for the ways in which authors use certain techniques to achieve an intended effect, they do use word choices, punctuation. They do, adopt a kind of persona or character, voluntarily or not, that, oftentimes is conveyed through the writing in very, very subtle ways. Oftentimes, I think that's why ethos is such a difficult rhetorical concept for many students. And they do use, facts to, convince people of things, right? So we tend to, in Western society, rely on, a restrictive in my mind, but generally, this kind of like idea of a shared concept of evidence, right? So if I make a claim, most of us will respond to the expectation that that claim should be backed up with some kind of evidence, right? So that's kind of, pathos, ethos, logos, right, as a concept. And I don't think that it matters if you really know those words as much as it matters that that authors use these things. So we're going to kind of, look at the way that these authors that are listed here use particular techniques. Now, the techniques are really, really wide ranging. Probably the most kind of easy technique to notice would be the use of pronouns, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But dialogue is another one. So we're really only looking at kind of two techniques for this assignment. That would be the use of dialogue. I'm going to talk to you about the distinction between dialogue and inner dialogue, and pronoun usage. Okay, so dialogue and pronoun usage as sort of rhetorical techniques that are used in writing to convey, you know, to get your message across, to use the phrasing. Your task for this particular assignment is it's not simply to analyze the excerpts. It's also going to be to kind of practice the construction of the analysis, so your own paragraphs. So next, you know, once I introduce you to the autoethnography, which I promise is going to happen soon, but once I introduce you to, you know, the autoethnography project that we're going to start working on pretty much for the rest of you've already been working on it, but we're going to be, you know, really working on it in earnest for the rest of the semester, or the term. You know, once you do that, then you'll be imitating these techniques. But for now, what I want you to focus on is a tendency to, you know, think about paragraph structure in terms of a 5-paragraph essay, which a lot of you have learned is an essay that has, I think, the most important part, not necessarily that it has 5 paragraphs, so that can be incredibly limiting, but that the paragraphs are often all constructed as the same length. So some of you have learned that a paragraph should be, you know, 5 to 7 sentences long, or, you know, whatever. Even if you haven't learned something that's specific, you probably naturally construct paragraphs of the same length because you have imitated samples that do that. But paragraph breaks are really an art, you know, based on, I think, what is, when they're done well, kind of a patterning that closely resembles speech, or should closely resemble speech, or can closely resemble speech. So if you think about when you're having a conversation with another person, or as I am right now, right, with myself, you don't speak in paragraphs. What you speak in are pauses, right? And a paragraph is like that. It's a pause. It's a kind of, it can be something as simple as a one-line pause between 2 paragraphs. It can be something as simple as just a kind of shift into a new perspective on the same topic. I think that's probably the easiest way to think about it if you are writing an essay about a thing, right? So you're more or less writing an essay here about these techniques, you know, so you are going to look at each technique. You're going to talk about each technique in a paragraph. You have been doing paragraph breaks. Some of you have not been doing paragraph breaks, but now is the time to really kind of think about, you know, how you have been taught to do paragraphs and how you can begin to expand your idea of what paragraph construction or paragraph breaks can look like. So, you're doing, you know, the standard 3-paragraph structure that a lot of you have learned. You've got 3 separate examples. And so you're kind of, you know, you're working with what many of you already know, but you're then trying to kind of expand that. And the 4th paragraph, usually you know, the conclusion paragraph, I'm asking you to write a fourth paragraph about what you think was important and or interesting about how these authors explored the lived experiences of microaggression. So your fourth paragraph is, I want you to think about this as really the part of this assignment where you're kind of breaking from a style that you have probably been taught in school. And instead of repeating earlier points that you would have had in the introduction, which is why we don't have an introduction, you're going to use this fourth paragraph as a first person reflection on really, the way in which the message, which is the lived experience of microaggression for all of these authors, on how kind of the work that you will have done to analyze each of these rhetorical techniques, really what you thought of it, what you thought of the exercise. So it's a kind of a moment of reflection on the process of composing this, which you've done a little bit of in the past. But it's also a moment to really kind of begin to think about the importance of utilizing technique, especially when you are trying to convey an experience that not all of your audience will necessarily have, they might identify with it, they might not have lived it. They might not identify with it, they might not have lived it. They might be totally ignorant about these experiences. And, this is really where you begin to think about, okay, who is my audience? What is my message? Who am I trying to reach? And how are the techniques that I adopt really going to reflect those motives, intentions, efforts, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so there's kind of a lot going on in this particular assignment, but the reason why I've put it here now is because I really want you to begin to practice with these kinds of techniques and start to kind of notice them with each thing that you're reading. So I'm going to break down each of these samples for you so you can kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. Okay, and the first one that we're going to talk about is just your basic dialogue. So I've given you page numbers so you can find, you don't have to read the entire thing. You can if you want. I actually really highly recommend this book. Minor Feelings is a book. It's just so good. Trust me. It's a really, really good book about xenophobia. All of these works are really about microaggressions and our recent publications, but we're only going to read pages 17 through 19. It's a very simple example of a microaggression moment. Okay, and what we're looking at really is the way in which Cathy Park Hong uses dialogue. So a lot of authors use dialogue. All of the authors that we're going to read use dialogue. And when you're doing an autoethnography, you really want to think about the use of dialogue. You also want to look at the way that dialogue is presented on the page, right? It's formal, the way that it's the way that people, many different ways, right? There's many different ways to present dialogue, but this is the most standard way. That's to, create a paragraph for each speaker, so that, the reader can kind of identify who's who. Some people don't do that. I'm not going to get into that because that's a little bit more sophisticated than what we're doing in this class right now. But it's just something to keep in mind, right? There's no 100% right way to do dialogue. It really depends on the artist and what they're trying to convey. But, dialogue is going to be a very important part of doing autoethnography. because when you're doing ethnographic research, a big part of what you're committed to is the way that people speak to each other. So this is if you're writing your paragraph about this, you're going to, kind of create the scenario. So this is a moment in the book when the author is representing a kind of typical exchange that involves a microaggression. So let's look at what it is, right? So a year ago, I read from this book at a small gallery in Crown Heights, New York. Afterwards, while I was smoking a cigarette outside with the curator of the event, and I want you to think about detail here, right? Because you've been learning about detail for this whole class, you've been practicing with it, but always look at when an author creates context, right? What is the meaning that we can gain from that context? You don't just want to give detail for the sake of detail, right? I see a lot of students using AI now, and the AI will generate this kind of, scenario, right? It's setting the stage, and it's always like focusing on the weather and the place and the feeling between the person and the weather. And it's like, okay, but like, why, right? Why do you always, why does the AI always generate this particular kind of scene? And really kind of thinking about the purpose, I think, is an important part, especially if you're going to use AI. You want to make sure that you understand what the AI is doing and why it's doing it, because the AI itself doesn't always know, right? So here you can see kind of like a purposeful example, right? She's reading from a book at a small gallery in Crown Heights, New York. So she's showing us that she's in a place that is known for being kind of hip, that's known for being a kind of place where artists and writers gather, and that it is a kind of, outside of the academic context. It's actually in the inside of the community, and it's a informal situation, right? So people have let their guards down, I think, is really the idea here. So when you're standing outside and you're smoking a cigarette, that's when people can kind of be like, hey, what's up? Just sort of say things. So the context here, is purposeful. The details are purposeful. So she's smoking a cigarette outside with the curator of the event. So this is the person who is putting the event on, the gallery manager, a white man with a beard and tattoos. So again, everything here, the context here is very purposeful, right? It's like the guy's got tattoos, he's got a beard, he's cool, he's probably, I mean, it sounds like a hipster to me, but whatever. So he saunters up to her. So he has decided, he sees her out there. He's heard her read from her work. He's, put on the event, basically. So he's in a position of relative power insofar as he's in charge of, he has some control over the audience, over the reception of the work, over the feeling in the gallery. And he comes up to her, and the first thing he says, right, he volunteers that he was taking a racial awareness seminar, which was a requirement for his job. So there's so much in this little half sentence moment, right? And this is really what I think all writers aim for, is this kind of concise statement that really, really says so much. So what does it say? Well, he saunters up, for one thing. So if you could look up the word saunter, but right, he's got a kind of, I've got something to say. And he focuses immediately on race and on his position as someone, as a white man who is, not necessarily interested in racial awareness himself, because he tells her, right, it's a requirement for his job. In other words, it's a moment of a microaggression already, because he says, I'm not interested in racial awareness. I have to do it for my work. So he's already aggressively told her that he doesn't think that he should be aware of her existence. And he's done that pretty aggressively. But, he's also seemingly in the position where he is talking to her because he has some investment in hearing her response, right? So my racial awareness mediator is smart, he said. I'm learning a lot. Okay, good, I said. He told me how minorities can't be racist against each other. That's bullshit, I said with a sharp laugh. So, right, we get this moment where he says this thing where the racial mediator has made a claim, and the claim he lets linger in the air, and she has this response, right, that that's bullshit. Are you calling my racial awareness mediator a liar? No, I said. He could just be misinformed. He also said Asians are next in line to be white, he said, crossing his arms, meaning, right, when you put the, and again, this is the power of description, right? When we cross our arms over our chest, it usually means that we're in a position of defense or insecurity. What do you think about that? So not only does his gesture show that he's in a defense mode, but then his words actually also convey that he's in a defense mode, right? He's actually in an offense mode. So not only is he defending himself, but he's attacking her, essentially demanding with his, italicized that she respond to a claim that he is making, which he is deflecting onto his so-called racial awareness mediator so that he doesn't have to take responsibility for it, right? So there's so much going on in this little exchange that she describes for us. And notice she doesn't tell us how to feel about anything. She's just describing a situation. So this is all that kind of power, the rhetorical power in the dialogue itself, right? The things that we feel that we're not even being told to feel, we're just experiencing them as a result of the way in which she's constructing the dialogue. I think you need a new racial awareness mediator, right? So in other words, your racial awareness mediator, the things that you're telling me that this person has said suggest that they're not competent at their job, right? Why are they not competent at their job? Well, because what you've just said that the racial awareness mediator said is actually racist, right? Asians are next in line to be white. There's, we could go on and on and on, but I'm supposed to only keep these recordings to a minimum, or I'm told you lose interest. So we'll skip over that for now. It's not true, he says, so he's still baiting her. I'm afraid not, I said, turning away from him. Why should I believe you? So I'm going to let that linger in the air for a minute, right? I'm afraid not, I said, turning away from him. Why should I believe you? So she's done with the conversation, right? Again, we get that description of the body where he crosses his arms, she turns away, right? I'm done with this conversation, and he still goes at it. So it is a moment of, aggression. And it's a microaggression, right? If it were a macroaggression, I guess he would be pushing her. My racial awareness mediator teaches this race stuff all the time. Why should I believe you? So again, right, just to kind of reiterate, what's simply said in the conversation is what is being written down. So there's this sense in which the author isn't really, what's the word I'm looking for? She's not fabricating anything, or at least we don't feel that she is, right? This feels like it could be any ordinary conversation that a person could have on the street. We've all had conversations like this, whether you're the person who's, the proverbial bearded tattooed man, or the person on the receiving end of those comments. It feels like an ordinary moment of microaggression. So it feels recorded, right? So if you're thinking about your field notebook and the kinds of things that you're supposed to be recording in your field notebook, this would be one of those instances, right? These kinds of conversations that we have or we overhear that are disturbing and upsetting, that are reflective of society's inequities, hierarchies, et cetera, right? So there's this kind of sense in which she's just writing things down. But we also see that, right, what is said reflects harmful dominant narratives about race, about authority, right? Because the racial awareness mediator is a so-called teacher who teaches race stuff. We know nothing about this person except for what this guy tells us. But he invokes the power and the authority of the teacher over and against the person who he's standing in front of, right? So this is a really disturbing moment when we see the way in which the role of the educator, the authority figure, the researcher can be weaponized to create harm to the average person, right? So that's something to really take into consideration. Patiently, and then we get her. So our dialogue ends, and then we get her reflection on what just happened. So this is going to be the same for you, right? You record something, and then you offer to the reader a path for understanding what that dialogue is doing. So let's see what she says. Patiently educating a clueless white person about race is draining. So in other words, right, I'm not going to do that right now. That's why I'm turning away, because it's draining. It takes all your powers of persuasion. So I'm giving you something back by educating you. And I have to decide for myself, are you worth it? Right. And it seems like this guy's really not worth it, because he's, basically a dick. Because it's more than a chat about race, it's ontological. It's like explaining to a person why you exist, or why you feel pain, or why your reality is distinct from their reality. And in fact, that's exactly what he is requiring of her in his microaggression, right? He's requiring an explanation for why her reality is distinct from his reality. And then she says, except it's even worse, right? It's even trickier than that, because the person has all of Western history, politics, literature, and mass culture on their side, proving that you don't exist. And that's a really, really powerful moment, right? It's because this guy isn't just this one asshole. It's that he is representative of a perspective, of an attitude, one that she describes as Western. And I think that's really important, right? Because it is this kind of demand for validation, that it comes from the perspective of power, right? It's like, I'm the one with the power, you're the one without the power, therefore your job is to validate me. And that's exactly what the content of the microaggression really amounts to. And since we're at it, why not read on, right? In other words, I didn't know whether to tell this guy to fuck off or give him a history lesson. We were here since we were here since 1587, exclamation point. I could have said. So what's the holdup? Where's our white Groupon? And Cathy Park Hong, by the way, if you do decide to get this book, is just really hilarious. She's super funny all the time. So you can read these horrible descriptions, whilst laughing. And that's her great strength as a writer. Right. So she's responding to his statement about the next in line to be white, right? What does that even mean, right? As if we're foreigners coming into a white space, when actually, right, we've been here since 1587, before there was even an America. Most Americans know nothing about Asian Americans. They think Chinese is synecdoche for Asians the way Kleenex is for tissues, right? So synecdoche being a stand-in. They don't understand that we're this tenuous alliance of many nationalities. There's so many qualifications weighing the we in Asian America. Do I mean Southeast Asian, South Asian, East Asian, and Pacific Islander, queer and straight, Muslim and non-Muslim, rich and poor? Are all Asians self-hating? What if my cannibalizing ego is not a racial phenomenon, but my own damn problem? And so this is that pan-ethnic labeling problem. So if you don't know what that is, look it up. If you do know what it is, then you'll understand, when the author is talking about the problem with pan-ethnic labeling, right? The problem with labeling all Asians in the same category, that you know, doing that is part of the reason for why microaggressions like this exist, because it is reductive. And she says, you know, and again, it's a unique condition that's distinctly Asian, and that some of us are economically doing better than any other minority group, but we barely exist anywhere in the public eye. So it's this, again, kind of going back to, you know, the harmful dominant narrative idea. It's this idea that because there are Asians that are economically doing better than any other minority group, that they are, quote unquote, next in line to be white, which is, you know, hardly even requires, or shouldn't require, according to the author, a justification for why that's a terrible comparison to make. But it also, I think, shows in the sentence, right? We barely exist anywhere in the public eye. It's an attempt at erasure of difference, which is, you know, if difference is non-white, then I think we can all see why that's a serious problem. Although it's now slowly changing, we've been mostly non-existent in politics, entertainment, and the media, and barely represented in the arts. Hollywood is still so racist against Asians that when there's a rare Asian extra in a film, I tense up, and I'm not even going to read that word, for the joke, and relax when there isn't one. Asians also have the highest income disparity out of any racial group. Among the working class, Asians are the invisible serfs of the garment and service industries, exposed to third world work conditions and sub-minimum wages. So notice how we go from this dialogue, which is a microaggression, a seemingly, you know, an annoying moment, and maybe a painful sting, but not usually taken to be, you know, kind of representative of, not taken by the person who's not on the receiving end of it to be necessarily as powerful and harmful as what we get here in this paragraph, where she puts it in the context of the actual discrimination on a large scale. So she's creating this parallel, right, between the macro reality and the micro reality. And I think in a lot of ways, that's really what you're aiming for when you're doing autoethnography, because it's kind of the meaning of autoethnography, right? It's like the individual experience inside of the whole context. And you get a kind of perfect image of that in these 2 pages. And then I'll just read the rest. Right. But when we complain, Americans suddenly know everything about us. And I think here, right, we're talking about, by Americans, right, we mean the bearded, you know, the representatives of the bearded, tattooed white man. Why are you pissed? You're next in line to be white, as if we're iPads queued up in an assembly line. And I think that's really, you know, a powerful connection, not only to what he, the point that the line that he said. So she's echoing that, and we're going to talk about inner dialogue next, which is this, right? Why are you pissed? You're next in line to be white, as though his words are echoing in her mind, as if we're iPads queued up in an assembly line. So you also get this kind of really incredible reference to technology and the development of technology, and its overlap with race and racism. So it's a great little moment to kind of study for thinking about the use of dialogue, the relationship between the micro and the macro in autoethnography, and the relationship between the micro and the macro in racist thinking. Okay, so I am going to switch gears, and then we're going to do the inner dialogue sample here from the Undocumented Americans, another really powerful, oftentimes very funny book written by Karla Villavicencio. an Ecuadorian writer and who I really encourage you to look up. She's also a DACA recipient. She graduated from Harvard. I believe she's currently a PhD student at Yale, or she might have recently graduated from Yale. And I bring up her credentials not because I really care about the credentials, but because she brings up her credentials frequently to talk about the way in which DACA students are have been used to advance a politics of respectability that is extremely harmful to people in the undocumented community who are not DACA recipients. And so it's a very, very powerful book if you are undocumented or from a mixed status family. It's kind of like, I would highly suggest that you read it. So the scenario here is basically the technique that's utilized, I'll start with that, is inner dialogue. So a lot of authors, just like with the dialogue example, utilize a technique called inner dialogue, which is where you make an effort to demonstrate for your reader the distinction between what is going on, what is visibly going on, right? The scene, the dialogue, right? If I'm watching the two people on the street talking, I can see that, I can hear that, but I don't know what they're thinking, right? Unless they tell me. So inner dialogue is when the author is showing, whether it's themselves or their characters or, whoever it is they're writing about, showing what's happening in the mind and what's happening on the outside. And so this is a kind of wonderful moment. And it's also a very ordinary moment where a bilingual child, has to translate in an institutional situation for their parents. And so oftentimes that will happen in the context of school, where you have a bilingual child translating to the teacher for their parents. It's a very adult thing to do because the teacher, right, might be asking you to translate, that you didn't do your work very well. So you can, I know a lot of students who've told me stories about them translating and kind of changing the meaning of what the teacher says, which is really funny. But also, in a situation, a much more serious situation where you're talking about medicine, right? So if you are at a doctor's office and you have to translate for your parents, the scenario here is could be very, very scary, right? Because you are translating your parents' medical condition, which could result in them being very ill or die, right? So she talks about this really kind of ordinary situation. So again, thinking about autoethnography, it's the individual and the society and the way in which a microaggression sort of plays out, in the context of race. All my life, I've accompanied my parents to the doctor. I think that's a really powerful sentence that reflects the experiences of many, many people. I'm their interpreter and advocate. They've gone to emergency room only once, being pretty good about preventative health care and making regular appointments at the local community health center that sees low-income people on a sliding scale. So again, with this kind of context, thinking about how you set the stage for something, what this sentence does is it says, my parents are actually responsible. They try to take care of themselves. Despite the fact that they don't have money, they don't have much money. For years, the chief doctor there was an Indian man who didn't speak great English and didn't speak great Spanish, but who spoke with patients of all nationalities and languages without an interpreter anyway. So she is, and this kind of goes back to the Cathy Park Hong, where it's like, racism comes in many forms, right? But also it goes back to that question of authority, right? If the teacher gets to speak on behalf of, here the doctor gets to speak on behalf of, and nobody gets to question it because they are in a position of authority. And so this man doesn't have any responsibility to learn how to create a situation in which his patients can effectively communicate with him, because he doesn't have to, right? He doesn't have to do that because he's already got his power. He didn't like me and I didn't like him. When my mom was in her 40s, she found a lump in her breast, and he explained to me why ordering mammograms for women in their 40s was a waste of resources, especially when the patient was uninsured and insurance couldn't pay for it. If you looked at the number of lives that early detection of breast cancer saved. I don't think doctors are supposed to worry about the bottom line, I tell him. So this is her speaking out loud, right? So notice that this is a dialogue moment. She doesn't use quotation marks, but she tells us you're supposed to see this as a moment where I speak out loud. Didn't you take an oath? And now switches all of a sudden to inner dialogue, because we know, and why do we know, right? We might not know that she doesn't say that out loud. If you're paying attention, right, if you're reading, right, you might go, did she actually just say that out loud? So you do a double take, or you might say, wait a minute, we just switched to inner dialogue, right? She didn't actually say that out loud. I'm maybe 18. Aren't you smart? He says. So she didn't say it out loud, right? Aren't you smart? He says. That's her. She goes to Harvard, my mom says. So this is a tricky moment where it feels like they are talking out loud. There's tension. But then again, because we don't get the quotation marks and we don't get the form that we're used to, it's not entirely clear whether any of this was actually said out loud. That's right, motherfucker. I go to school in Boston. Well, not Boston, Cambridge. Just a little school in Cambridge, right? She's talking about Harvard. One day I'll make so much money that I'll pay for my mom's mammograms in cash and crisp $1 bills like a motherfucking kingpin. I'll buy this clinic and turn it into a museum for myself in honor of me. I can hang up your children's diplomas for a special exhibition on children of doctors who go to state school, you cheap ass motherfucker. I will ruin you. So this is an incredible moment of what you call momentum building in writing, right? Where each sentence develops from the last and gets more and more kind of extreme in its reaction. And so we know that we're now in this space of, you know, we maybe we don't know, right? Maybe we still think that we're in the space of actually words being said. So we get this kind of power, and then we get this incredible paragraph break into a single line paragraph. So as I said before, right, you get these paragraph breaks where you get a pause, a moment to a kind of full stop moment, right? And you get your quotation marks. She has history of breast cancer in her family, is what I actually said. So this moment forces us to go back and reread what we read, because we're like, wait, what just happened? What just happened with those, you know, you can do a lot with a punctuation mark, right? So none of it seems like it was said. It seems like what was said is simply, right, that the doctor didn't want to order a mammogram. Right? He explained to me why ordering mammograms for men in their 40s was a waste of resources. And her response to that internally was this whole imagined dialogue flashing in her mind, right? Her mom, her saying, right, something about his motives in saying that. Her mom's kind of defense of her, and then her tirade about, you know, what an asshole he is, all happens inside of her mind, and that's inner dialogue. And so when you're going to utilize this technique, you want to do it like this, right? You always want it to pack a real punch, right? You want it to really show the distinction between what we feel inside and what we perform on the outside. And I think that we're kind of living in a time where this technique is probably particularly powerful because a lot of us feel things that we don't say out loud, for many, many, many different kinds of political, cultural reasons, you know, basic fear. And then, you know, we have this version of ourselves that we present to the world. And the version of herself that she presents to this doctor is one that is really, really careful and aware of the doctor's power to order or not order the test for her mom. So if she does go on this tirade, right, if she does call him a cheap ass motherfucker to his face, if she does tell him that she'll ruin him, the suggestion here is that the only thing that will happen as a result of that is that her mother will not get the test that she needs. So she has to contain herself, and she has to put on this front, and she has to simply, right, make up what is maybe a lie, maybe not a lie, in order to say the thing that is expected of her to get the thing that she needs for her family. So that is, again, another kind of incredible, oh yeah, there it is, a lie, right? I'd appreciate it if you ordered one. So it's this incredible moment. Again, you see this very, very long paragraph. It's a very powerful paragraph. It's doing a lot of things with italics, with punctuation. And then you get these 3 one-line paragraphs that are full stop, that really make us think, and that really help us to internalize the length and the weight of the paragraph that comes before those 3 lines. So really, really kind of a great example to focus on when you're trying to think about paragraph breaks, when you're trying to think about using inner dialogue techniques. Keep coming back to this one. And then finally, I know this is a long video, but you can pause it and you can come back to it. I'm still working on how, figuring out a way to do these videos with time stamps and, organization, but I do not have the time right now to work through that. So finally, you get citizen, which is I think one student who did the assignment already said, I basically, I didn't even know what that was. And, I appreciate that because, Citizen is written by a poet, Claudia Rankine, and it really is kind of a series of fragments of stories, of descriptions of microaggressions that can be very, very difficult if you don't really know what's happening. So I accidentally put on the original assignment page 12, but I meant to put page 12 to 18. I don't know how that got cut off. So you've got basically 6 pages of this. Each one of these is and I threw in a Martin Luther King's Jr. letter from Birmingham jail, which is a kind of another example. But the series that we're looking at with Citizen, if I have the bandwidth, I'll do the Martin Luther King. Yep, where'd it go? But if you go to page 12, we're going to skip ahead a little bit, just because I think some of these are more just kind of easier for us to focus on. So the reason why we're looking at this example is because we're going to switch now. We're moving out of dialogue and into the use of pronouns. So when you're writing for, when you're trying to create an intended effect and you're thinking about, most of us have been trained to write objectively in the 3rd person, right? And never use the 1st person pronoun, whether that's in the singular or the plural, right? Never say I, never say I think, never, never say we. Sometimes I've seen students use a kind of like rhetorical you, which is what we're going to look at here, to try, where they've been taught that they can utilize you as a rhetorical strategy for, getting people, like a direct address to the reader, to get them to kind of imagine a situation, right? Picture yourself in a pool right now, something like that, right? But actually, right, using a 2nd person, so addressing the reader directly, is really, really difficult. If I were to, and as a kind of comparison, if I were to think about rhetorical uses of we, if I'm writing something and I'm trying to get people who don't agree with me to agree with me, then it makes most sense for me to utilize the collective we to show, you, reader, might think that you and I don't share things, but actually when I use the we, it feels like we do, right? So it has this kind of psychological effect of establishing a collective experience where there might not in fact be one, but where there might not in fact be one that is perceived, right, universally by the people who are reading. There might in fact be a collective experience, but it might not be part of the dominant narrative that is at work. So authors, and that's what Martin Luther King Jr. does, right? He uses the collective we to make arguments for integration. And he makes those arguments directly to, in the letter from Birmingham jail, he makes those arguments directly to a group of white clergymen in Birmingham to get them to support integration efforts during the civil rights movement. So, he uses we all the time. Now, Citizen is about the experiences of microaggression of a Black woman. And when we have taught the use of second person in the past, oftentimes we focus on avoiding the second person at all costs because it puts the reader on the defense. So, you want to be, you only want to use you if you really know what you're doing, right? Because if you don't really know what you're doing, then your reader is going to say, why are you talking to me? Right? Don't tell me anything about myself, right? What do you know about me? So utilizing you in this way is incredibly powerful. Just as utilizing we can be very powerful, right? But utilizing you, where utilizing we creates this kind of feeling of a collective experience, the use of you feels more like an indictment, right? A call out. It puts the reader on the defense. In the case of Citizen, the constant and frequent use of you feels like it's doing many, many things. So let's start with the first example on page 12. Because of your elite status from a year's worth of travel, you have already settled into your window seat on United Airlines when the girl and her mother arrive at your row. The girl looking over at you tells her mother, "These are our seats, but this is not what I expected." Notice the switch from the you to the I. But this is not what I expected. The mother's response is barely audible. "I see," she says. "I'll sit in the middle." So this is a moment where, you have to really, again, just like you did with the Villavicencio, read and reread because it's unclear. It's a fragment. There is no contextualizing that's being done for you. You simply are in the middle of this action and you have to kind of orient yourself. So if you're the you here, you are the person sitting in the window seat, right? And the mother and girl arrive at your row. The girl says, "These are our seats," and you're not expecting it because who knows, right? This is not what I expected. So suddenly you're not in the position of the person looking out the window. You're the reader again, right? And you're actually now being asked to not identify with what is happening in this scene, but to look at it from the objective third person. So it's a confusing moment. It's a kind of dizzying moment. And then you get this line, "The mother's response is barely audible." So the mother knows that the daughter is responding to the fact that she is seeing a Black woman in the window seat, meaning, right, these are our seats, these two seats, and there's a Black woman in the seat, and that bothers me, right, this child. And so it's a moment that's very unexpected. And the mother, instead of responding in a way that would correct the child's behavior says, I understand what you mean. You don't want to sit next to a Black woman who's looking out the window. I'll sit in the middle. And so this is a very, very powerful moment of microaggression that the writer is inviting in the use of you for us not only to feel, but also acts in the way that I just mentioned as an indictment against the you, right? Who are you, reader, in this scenario? And that's why we get that shift to the I. We get that shift to the third person in the last sentence. I see, she says, I'll sit in the middle. And notice that there's no punctuation here. There's no scene. Really, it's not even a conventional moment of kind of writing. It requires you to sit with it, and it's very, very short. And then, you get more of this, right? A woman you do not know wants to join you for lunch. So again, you are me, Claudia Rankine, the person writing about microaggressions. You are being asked, invited, required to occupy my positioning in this reading. So it functions both as an invitation and an indictment, right? You must be me here. In the cafe, you both order the Caesar salad. This overlap is not the beginning of anything because she immediately points out that she, her father, her grandfather, and you all attended the same college. She wanted her son to go there as well, but because of affirmative action or minority something, she's not sure what they're calling it these days, and weren't they supposed to get rid of it? Again, right, pronoun it here being very powerful, just as the pronoun this in the previous one is very powerful. We have to go back and we have to look at the this that is being referred to, or the it that is being referred to, and here it being the minority something, which is not named because this woman does not do the work of actually figuring out what that is. Her son wasn't accepted. You're not sure if you're meant to apologize for this failure of your alma mater's legacy program. Instead, you ask where he ended up. The prestigious school she mentions doesn't seem to assuage her irritation. This exchange, in effect, ends your lunch. The salads arrive. So this is a really powerful moment of microaggression, right? Where the previous example creates this kind of dizzying effect, where you see generational racism at work. This one is just a very straightforward moment where a white woman is, in fact, it's really reminiscent of the Cathy Park Hong example with the guy with the tattoos and the beard, right? It's like this woman is demanding that in this case, the Black woman be accountable for the white woman's negative feelings about affirmative action, and that she, like the Black woman, that she assuage her feelings about it. So she asks herself, right? She says, you're not sure if you're meant to apologize for this failure, right? You're not sure what you're supposed to do. You're not sure exactly what is being required of you in this moment. But, you get the sense that you're supposed to, in some way, be accountable for this much larger issue. So in other words, again, right, you see the individual and the society in which they have to live their lives, have conversations, meet people, have lunch, right? The salads arrive, it's the beginning of lunch. This horrible person, now you have to sit with them for an hour, and God knows what that's going to feel like. And that is your experience on a daily basis. So the use of the pronoun here, the you, is really, really complex. I am not going to read the rest, but they're all very similar, and you can decide which one, if you want to talk about the ones I just talked about, or if you want to talk about a different one. But if you go to the Martin Luther King, this really long paragraph at the bottom of page 2 is where he uses the collective we to kind of bring in his his efforts, his rhetorical efforts to convince his audience that there is a shared experience that they might not be recognizing as a shared experience, right? So, doing a little bit of comparison contrast work here would be really useful, right? How does the we work in this particular moment? How does the you work in a particular moment? Really beginning to think about when an author is using pronouns like this, how the pronoun use reflects a particular perception of the audience, a particular awareness of the audience, a particular goal or purpose to either convince or compel or move the audience in one way or another. And I think it's also important for you to think about the ways in which there are different audiences for different works, right? If we reduce the audience to sort of one monolithic group, we're kind of engaging in a version of pan-ethnic labeling, right? Where we just think of the so-called reader as kind of like anyone. But when you're writing, you're never writing for a kind of, faceless or even, kind of stereotyped community. You're writing for actual people. And so you really need to think about what kind of person will pick this up and read it. If you're in this class and you're writing for your classmates, right, you have a pretty diverse group of people, that really the only thing they share, there's two things, right, that they share. One is that they are students and they're trying to get an education. How they feel about that education might be very different. How they are experiencing the virtual classroom space, it might be very different. How their experience writing might be very different, reading, etc. But you can write with the understanding that you are writing an autoethnography about education, about your education for a group of students who are experiencing education. And so, you want to think about what kinds of students you feel that you most identify with, least identify with, knowing all the while that they're all going to be reading this, right? So if you're thinking about audience, right, it's like anyone interested in and having experience with education. It's a pretty broad audience. So you really want to think about, who's going to be interested and who isn't. Likewise, in these authors are really thinking about their audiences, right? So I've already told you who Martin Luther King Jr.'s audience is, but Claudia Rankine's audience would be, probably people who are familiar with her work, other poets, people who are invested in kind of race, discussions about race, and those people will be a wide range of races who are reading this. And, for the most part, Claudia Rankine is somebody who is going to be read by educated sort of academic types, right? So that's why a lot of her scenarios really do kind of reflect the life and the world of a person who is who is in the academic community, hence the prestigious school, hence the traveling first class, right? So really paying attention to who is going to respond and how they're going to respond to the techniques that are being utilized. All right, everybody. Well, that is all I've got for today. Hope that helps, and stay tuned for the next assignment coming soon.